Welcome to Footnotes. My name is Dan, and I'm here to equip Christians to explore the Bible, theology, and the Christian life while remaining rooted in the essentials of the faith. Today we're continuing the topic of the value of orthodoxy. We began this series of conversations by looking at the Apostles' Creed and some of the earliest expressions of orthodoxy. We then moved forward in time and looked at the ecumenical councils and also examined what to do when you reach the point, either in church history or in your own experience, when there are competing definitions of orthodoxy, competing creeds and confessions. There are a few different approaches to that dilemma. I hope that you're beginning to see the value part of the value of orthodoxy. I really hope that that comes through in this series of conversations, both now and in the future. And one of those values is the unifying power of orthodoxy. You've probably noticed that I've talked a lot about that, and I've been hinting towards that. And you may have some questions about that, because after all, the word ecumenical is a bit controversial. It can be negative to some. It can have very bad connotations. So I want to address some concerns that might arise when we start talking about unity and ecumenism and anything like that. I know that can be scary to some. It can be a red flag to some when you start saying things like that. So I want to define what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. So in this exploration of orthodoxy and the unifying power that it has, what we're not doing is compromising or ignoring and downplaying disagreements. We want to respect and appreciate the diversity of churches and denominations and the things that they emphasize, without trying to water any of that down or put it to the side as unimportant. This is also not about being driven by pragmatism. It's not just about finding what will please everybody or defining convictions by what results in the most cooperation. We're also not just defining orthodoxy by arbitrarily selecting some things that we have in common. We're going back to the New Testament, the early church, the ecumenical creeds and councils, and the great teachers of the faith. Something that's helpful in this arena is what can be called the Vincentian method. This is discussed by Thomas Oden, especially in his book Classic Christianity, which we will cover later. And this comes from, as the name might imply, a man named Vincent of Lerons. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but in any case, he lived in the early centuries and he wrote about the importance of defining orthodoxy through three tests or three filters. And the simple way to put it is what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. So what has been believed everywhere, not just in one geographic location or one isolated group in the world. What has been believed always? It has to go back to the apostolic tradition. It can't just be a new teaching that has popped up. It has to go all the way back to the earliest church. And by all. What has been believed by all Christians of all stripes, all traditions and denominations, not just by one particular group. So once you put things through that filter, what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all, you arrive at orthodoxy, consensual Christianity. And orthodoxy belongs to the whole church. It doesn't just belong to one group. I think that's important to think about. We can sometimes, I've sometimes run into this in conversations with people, that we can sometimes start to act as though our particular tradition or our particular church is the guardian of orthodoxy. Now, it's important to remember that by definition that doesn't make any sense, because orthodoxy is what belongs to the whole church. It's what the whole church is defined by. Focusing on the essentials will simultaneously guard us against both extremes. The extreme of isolation or sectarianism, because it rallies us around the same things, it unifies us, we find common ground. And on the other hand, the extreme of compromise or syncretism, because we stay grounded in the apostolic tradition. That's why I like this approach of unity through orthodoxy. I have a couple analogies that might help us here, and they're not perfect, but they're just things that I've been thinking about lately. The first one is to think of the body of Christ like a sort of club or a sort of group that you're a member of. And let's say that there's a primary badge of membership, and we all recognize it. It's very clear. And then there are the denominations or the traditions that we recognize in Christianity, and those are like the sort of cliques or subgroups that form within the club. And they each have their own additional paraphernalia and badges. Now, as soon as that happens, there's the risk of these secondary badges and all this other stuff covering or detracting from the primary badge. So that's something to watch out for. And this can happen in different ways. One way is that we start to focus on distinctives or convictions that are particular to our group. And it's very easy to do, especially when it's in the name of the group, which is very common. I mean, many denominations are named after the things that they are distinctively known for or passionately dogmatic about. So it's very easy to start to see everything through that lens and to forget that Christianity is broader than that. It's not just about that one issue. We need to make sure that the primary badge of Christianity, Christian identity, is prominent. It's not lost in the mix. We need to make sure that it's not covered up. Acknowledge it also in those from other groups. Now, perhaps a better analogy is a tree analogy. And I really like this one, and this is a basic one that we already use even in the terms branches of the church or branches of theology, or being rooted in the essentials. Now, this is similar to Paul's olive tree metaphor in Romans 11, where he was dealing with Jew and Gentile issues. The different traditions or denominations are like different branches, and it's easy to focus on how different and far apart we are, or try to claim superiority over each other, and forget that we're all part of the same tree. We're being nourished by the same trunk and roots. And that would be classic Orthodoxy, the foundation of the apostles, the New Testament. Now, the trunk and branches are both necessary. We shouldn't confuse one for the other or leave out either. There's several dangers there where we act as though we can lop off all the branches and just have the trunk. And that's one problem. Or we act like our branch can exist on its own, or we confuse it as being the trunk and the roots. These are all important, though. There's a continuum from the traditions to local churches, to families, to individuals, that goes from trunk to branches to twigs to leaves. And so all of these parts of the tree are important. If the church is like this tree, then every level of it is important and every part of it is important. That's just one helpful analogy to start to think about some of these things and to remember that we're all part of this same tree. That also can help you think about what happens when you cut yourself off from that tree. If you cut yourself off from orthodoxy, if you go into heresy, if you start to cut yourself off from the church generally, you are cutting off your source of life and nourishment. If you are cutting yourself off from Christ as the vine, you're cutting yourself off from your source of nourishment. Let's talk about what happens when you try to find this consensus. Some people debate whether this is even possible. Is there even such a thing as consensual Christianity? Can we even boil down everything into a common factor? What happens when you try to find the highest common factor, the purest distillation, or the common consensus regarding aspects and beliefs of Christianity? Well, there are a couple books that we're going to look at in the next few conversations that demonstrate that the results of that process is far from something weak or watered down. It is something quite powerful and compelling. The first book that we're going to look at is Mere Christianity. Now, this is a classic, and I have it in the format here of a book that contains several C.S. Lewis works. So it's a larger book called C.S. Lewis's Signature Classics. It's a collection, but you can also get it on its own. And I'm sure that you've heard of this book. It's very well known. At least I feel like it is. I feel like everyone talks about it. I don't know how many of us have actually read it. I hadn't read it until recently, so it was very good to actually sit down and read it. It's written to explain and defend the Christian faith to outsiders in a way that tries not to privilege any one denomination over another. And this is done with an easygoing conversational tone that makes the concepts accessible and avoids technical language. Now, readers may not agree with C.S. Lewis on every opinion and on every topic. He has some views on certain issues that you may get uncomfortable with, you may disagree with, and that's fine. But he presents some great insights on the nature and purpose of the Christian life. And Christians can benefit from that as much as non-Christians. So let's take a little look at the structure of this book. It's split into 4 parts or 4 books. Book 1 is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. So that's where he starts to lay out an apologetic case based on our natural intuitions about morality. Apologetic case for Christianity. And then book 2 is about what Christians believe. He starts to go into different conceptions of God and what Christians believe about God. Book 3 is about Christian behavior. This is where he addresses a lot about morality and ethics. And then book 4 is Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And that's where he gets a little more advanced and starts to get into some more advanced concepts and make them as accessible as he can. In the preface, he explains how this originated as broadcast talks given on the air, on the radio. So it's interesting to read about that and to think about that, how these were originally written for him to give over the radio, and they've been formatted and edited into a book form. There's going to be many changes there. He explains some of that. Lewis is not afraid of saying where he's coming from, what his position is. He doesn't try to hide that he is Anglican, the Church of England. He says he's not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. He's not trying to convert anyone to that position, but then he goes on to explain his reasoning of trying to give a defense for Christianity generally. He starts to talk about disagreements that different Christian groups have had and the difficulty that presents in writing a book like this. He gives some examples, like beliefs about the Virgin Mary. But he also says that, oddly enough, you cannot even conclude from my silence on disputed points either that I think them important or that I think them unimportant. For this is itself one of the disputed points. One of the things Christians are disagreed about is the importance of their disagreements. When 2 Christians of different denominations start arguing, it is usually not long before one asks whether such and such a point really matters, and the other replies, "Matter? Why, it's absolutely essential." I thought that was a great paragraph, just explaining the irony that we can't even agree on how important our disagreements are. He also goes on to talk about mere Christianity, which, by the way, he doesn't explain in detail where that comes from, but I believe it comes from Richard Baxter, that phrase or that idea of a mere Christian or mere Christianity. So that's an interesting historical thing that you can chase down if you want to. But he says that, as far as he can tell, that he has succeeded in expressing this common or central or mere Christianity, and that it may possibly be of some help in silencing the view that if we omit the disputed points, we shall have left only a vague and bloodless highest common factor. The highest common factor turns out to be something not only positive but pungent, divided from all non-Christian beliefs by a chasm, to which the worst divisions inside Christendom are not really comparable at all. If I have not directly helped the cause of reunion, I have perhaps made it clear why we ought to be reunited. In Book 1, Lewis lays out the case for Christianity, starting with the intuitions we have about right and wrong. We all know that there should be right and wrong, but how do we know that? How do we have a sense of that? And this is a classic kind of argument towards Christianity. arguing from nature, arguing from what we intuitively have a sense of, what we can observe. So he starts to reason logically through that and starts to make his way towards a Christian, an argument for the Christian faith. In book 2, he starts talking about what Christians believe about God. He discusses rival conceptions of God, different ways of picturing God, atheism, different kinds of religious beliefs and ways of approaching the question of God. He says, any enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you are really listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going. He does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean at this time of day to reintroduce our old friend the devil? Hoofs and horns and all? Well, what the time of day has to do with it I do not know, and I am not particular about the hoofs and horns. But in other respects, my answer is yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry, if you really want to, you will. Whether you'll like it when you do is another question. I thought that was a great quote there. Lewis addresses the claims about Jesus, what he claimed about himself, what Christians claim about him. He says that he unhesitatingly behaved as if he was the party chiefly concerned, the person chiefly offended in all offenses. This makes sense only if he really was the God whose laws are broken and whose love is wounded in every sin. Lewis says that he's trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So there you get the classic trilemma that Lewis presents. Jesus is either liar, lunatic, or Lord. Those are the options he gives us. In discussing the new life that we have in Christ and the way that we interact with things like the communion and the Lord's Supper, he says, do not think that I am setting up baptism and belief and the Holy Communion as things that will do instead of your own attempts to copy Christ. Your natural life is derived from your parents. That does not mean it will stay there if you do nothing about it. You can lose it by neglect, or you can drive it away by committing suicide. You have to feed it and look after it. But always remember, you are not making it. You are only keeping up a life you got from someone else. In the same way, a Christian can lose the Christ life which has been put into him, and he has to make efforts to keep it. But even the best Christian that ever lived is not acting on his own steam. He is only nourishing or protecting a life he could never have acquired by his own efforts. And that has practical consequences. As long as the natural life is in your body, it will do a lot towards repairing that body. Cut it, and up to a point it will heal, as a dead body would not. A live body is not one that never gets hurt, but one that can, to some extent, repair itself. In the same way, a Christian is not a man who never goes wrong, but a man who is enabled to repent and pick himself up and begin over again after each stumble, because the Christ life is inside him, repairing him all the time, enabling him to repeat in some degree the kind of voluntary death which Christ himself carried out. I thought that was a good way of talking about the life that we have through Christ and that interaction of our choices, our actions, our obedience, and God's grace. In Book 3, Lewis begins to talk about Christian behavior. He goes over the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. and teaches through those and what the main points of those are. I think that's valuable. He makes a distinction between doing a just action and being a just person. A man who perseveres in doing just actions gets in the end a certain quality of character. Now, it is that quality, rather than the particular actions, which we mean when we talk of a virtue. This is an important distinction. Otherwise, you might think that, provided you did the right thing, it did not matter how or why you did it. And he goes on to explain that. Secondly, we might think that God wanted simply obedience to a set of rules, whereas he really wants people of a particular sort. And thirdly, we might think that the virtues were necessary only for this present life, that in the other world we could stop being just because there's nothing to quarrel about, and stop being brave because there's no danger. He goes on to explain the problems with that kind of thinking. I thought those were good points about virtue and the nature of ethics and virtue. There's an interesting passage where Lewis addresses this point about money, and he says there's one bit of advice given us by the ancient heathen Greeks and by the Jews in the Old Testament and by the great Christian teachers of the Middle Ages, which the modern economic system has completely disobeyed. All these people told us not to lend money at interest. And lending money at interest, what we call investment, is the basis of our whole system. And he goes on to discuss what might follow from that, how we might respond to that. I thought that was a very interesting and somewhat unexpected point to bring up, but it's interesting to think about. Our whole system is based on debt and lending and investment and interest, which many of these ancient civilizations told us not to do. So what we do with that is another question. In the section on faith, Lewis addresses how faith must be fed, it must be maintained. Your moods will change, situations will change. That is why daily prayers, religious readings, church going, and things like that are necessary parts of the Christian life. We have to be continually reminded of what we believe. Neither this belief nor any other will automatically remain alive in the mind. It must be fed. And as a matter of fact, if you examined 100 people who had lost their faith in Christianity, I wonder how many of them would turn out to have been reasoned out of it by honest argument. Do not most people simply drift away? Then he addresses the aspect of faith that has to do with endurance and loyalty. He points out that when you begin to practice the Christian virtues, things go well initially, but you can only see over a longer period of time how things really go. No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation means. This is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation really means. The only complete realist. The main thing we learn from a serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues is that we fail. If there was any idea that God had set us a sort of exam and that we might get good marks by deserving them, that has to be wiped out. If there was any idea of a sort of bargain, any idea that we could perform our side of the contract and thus put God in our debt so that it was up to him in mere justice to perform his side, that has to be wiped out. In a further section on faith, Lewis has some further comments on the interaction of our works or our obedience and God's work in us. He quotes the verse that says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." He says, this looks as if everything depended on us and our good actions. But the second half goes on, "For it is God who worketh in you," which looks as if God did everything and we nothing. I am afraid this is the sort of thing we come up against in Christianity. I am puzzled, but I am not surprised. You see, We are now trying to understand and to separate into watertight compartments what exactly God does and what man does when God and man are working together. And of course, we begin by thinking it is like two men working together, so that you could say, he did this bit and I did that. But this way of thinking breaks down. God is not like that. He is inside you as well as outside. Even if we could understand who did what, I do not think human language could properly express it. In the attempt to express it, different churches say different things. But you will find that even those who insist most strongly on the importance of good actions tell you you need faith. And even those who insist most strongly on faith tell you to do good actions. At any rate, that is as far as I can go. I like that section. I like his simple explanation there, without getting into technical terminology or bogged down into theological discussions of holding those two things together. And honestly, that's a lot of what happens in Christianity. There's a lot of strange things that we just have to hold different truths together in a mysterious way. And as he points out, different Christian traditions will often emphasize one or other of those sides of the paradox. And that will give rise to what seems like a debate over who is right and who is wrong, when in reality, they are simply bringing out different truths that are both there in the text. In Book 4, he starts to get into an explanation about the Trinity. And this is where he gets a little more philosophical, a little more advanced. He employs a lot of different analogies to try to get us to start thinking about the nature of God. Lewis says, "Now that is the first thing to get clear. What God begets is God, just as what man begets is man. What God creates is not God, just as what man makes is not man. That is why men are not sons of God in the sense that Christ is. They may be like God in certain ways, but they are not things of the same kind. They are more like statues or pictures of God." He then goes on to explain this idea of the likeness or the image of God concept, and some different analogies and ways that we can think of it. And he talks about the idea of statues. He says, "That is precisely what Christianity is about. This world is a great sculptor's shop. We are the statues, and there is a rumor going round the shop that some of us are someday going to come to life." In talking about the Trinity, Lewis addresses the importance of the concept of love. People are fond of saying that God is love, but they seem not to notice that the words God is love have no real meaning unless God contains at least two persons. Love is something that one person has for another person. If God was a single person, then before the world was made, he was not love. The living, dynamic activity of love has been going on in God forever and has created everything else. In talking about the Holy Spirit, Lewis says, "Do not be worried or surprised if you find him rather vaguer or more shadowy in your mind than the other two. I think there is a reason why that must be so. In the Christian life, you are not usually looking at him. He is always acting through you. If you think of the Father as something out there, in front of you, and of the Son as someone standing at your side, helping you to pray, trying to turn you into another son, then you have to think of the third person as something inside you or behind you. Perhaps some people might find it easier to begin with the third person and work backwards. God is love, and that love works through men, especially through the whole community of Christians. But this spirit of love is, from all eternity, a love going on between the Father and the Son." In the final chapters, Lewis addresses the topics of whether Christianity is hard or easy, and what sort of people God is making us into, and what the goal is of Christianity, the outcome. Overall, Mere Christianity is a great read for Christians and non-Christians alike. I really recommend it. As I said before, you may not agree with every idea in it, but he certainly provides a lot of useful ways of thinking about the Christian life, and different ways that you may not have encountered before. He's very imaginative. He's obviously very well read and loves literature and stories. He's a very good communicator, and it's put in simple language. Now, it is from a few decades ago now, so some may find it a little dated, but it's not really that dated. It's very accessible and readable even for today. In the next conversation, we're going to look at the book Simply Christian by N.T. Wright. This is a very similar kind of book to Mere Christianity, but I wanted to cover both books because they each have their strengths and weaknesses, and Simply Christian is, of course, a more recent book, so it may be able to speak better to a more recent audience.